This was life for civilians under the night was always the first thing people remembered. Not the speeches, not the rallies, not even the banners that would later spread across the city like a second skin. It was the silence of the night, the kind of silence that seemed to settle deeper than the cobblestones themselves, pressing against the chest of every man, woman, and child who dared to listen too closely. You could stand at your window, curtains drawn half shut, and hear nothing but your own breathing. Yet beneath that nothing, there was always the sense that something was already happening, an invisible current moving through the air. Before the uniforms became familiar, before neighbors began to disappear, before children were taught new words to replace the old ones, there was only that silence, that waiting, that breathless pause. People told themselves it was normal. Change comes slowly, like frost spreading across a field, unseen until suddenly the whole harvest is gone. A new government, a promise of strength, the revival of pride. Ordinary shopkeepers repeated those lines with hesitant optimism. Mothers whispered them in kitchens while stirring thin soup, and fathers tried to believe them as they unfolded the newspaper with hands that trembled just enough to betray doubt. "Things are getting better," they would say, though the words often floated into the air without an anchor, dissolving as quickly as they were spoken. What was life like before fear had a name? It was subtle. It was the small hesitation before greeting a stranger on the street. It was the way laughter at the tavern lost a certain boldness, softening into something polite and cautious. It was the way children looked at their parents, sensing the unspoken rules, learning not to ask why. Certain books had been quietly removed from the shelves, or why the neighbor across the hall no longer smiled the way she used to. It was the tightening of the world without chains, the shrinking of air without walls. The silence became a teacher. It taught people to lower their voices, to glance behind before speaking. It trained them to sense danger in ordinary things. An open window, a knock at the wrong hour, a friend who lingered too long after curfew. The silence grew heavy, pressing against hearts until people began to carry it within themselves. You could feel it in the breadline, in the post office, even in the church pews. No one told you directly to stop asking questions. Instead, the silence itself showed you that some questions would never again be safe to ask. But there was another layer too, one harder to describe. It was the strange mixture of hope and dread. Many civilians still wanted to believe in renewal, in a nation rising again from humiliation. Pride is a dangerous hunger. It feeds even when the body starves. So there were faces lit by determination, voices eager to believe that the promises on the radio meant something real. Work will come, food will come, dignity will return. People repeated those lines not only to others but to themselves, as if saying them aloud could conjure truth from the echo. At the same time, another whisper was forming. Not in words, but in the way the baker closed his shop earlier than usual, in the way the teacher paused before writing certain lessons on the board, in the way the old woman next door locked her door twice instead of once. Something was coming, something that would not stay hidden forever. You didn't need to read political essays or understand ideology. You could sense it in your bones, the way animals sense storms before the first drop of rain falls. And yet in those early days, life still carried its routines. Bread still needed to be baked, fields still tilled, children still sent to school. The marketplace buzzed, though its chatter was quieter than before. People still fell in love, still quarreled with their families, still told jokes that had nothing to do with politics. That was perhaps the cruelest part of all. How ordinary everything seemed, even as the roots of something monstrous pushed deeper into the soil beneath their feet. The silence did not erase daily life. It simply poisoned it, turning even the most innocent acts into rehearsals for survival. Imagine walking down a familiar street, past houses you have known since childhood. The paint on the doors is peeling, laundry flutters from balconies, the smell of cabbage soup drifts from an open kitchen window. And yet you notice that people no longer pause at corners to gossip. Eyes slide away from one another. Doors close, just a little faster. The sound of marching boots from far away begins to carry more weight than the laughter of children. Nothing has truly changed, and yet everything has. That was the silence before fear, ordinary life suspended over a shadow that no one dared to name. For children, it was confusing. They were taught to sing new songs at school, words that sounded powerful but felt heavy in their mouths. They brought those songs home, humming them in hallways, not knowing why their parents fell quiet when they heard them. Parents smiled thinly, telling them to practice, encouraging them, but later, behind closed doors, they whispered to one another, "We must be careful." Even with the children, the silence reached into families, setting invisible boundaries even between blood. For the elderly, it was familiar in a different way. They had seen empires rise and fall, leaders come and go. Some nodded knowingly, saying, "This too shall pass." Others grew afraid in ways they could not admit, remembering wars past and the devastation that had followed. The silence was not new to them. It was a shadow they had seen before. And yet this time, it seemed thicker, more deliberate, as though it had been planted and cultivated. For the young adults, the ones eager to prove themselves, the silence was easy to ignore. They were hungry for belonging, for meaning, for a role in history larger than themselves. The rallies, the flags, the shouts of unity offered them something intoxicating. They did not hear silence. They heard a call. They marched into it, not realizing how quickly that call would devour them. And so, the silence spread, seeping into walls, into skin, into breath. It became a second heartbeat, pulsing in rhythm with every step taken on the cobblestones of ordinary towns. By the time the silence gave way to open fear, it was already too late. People had learned how to live with it, how to breathe in its rhythm, how to mistake it for normalcy. And that was the cruelest deception of all. The idea that nothing was wrong. Even as everything was changing, the silence before fear was not empty. It was full of promises unfulfilled, of glances that carried too much meaning, of voices that died in throats before they could be spoken aloud. It was full of warnings disguised as routine, of dangers hidden in plain sight. It was the foundation upon which the regime would build its world. And if you had been there, if you had lived among those cobblestones and kitchens and bread lines, you would have felt it too. You might tell yourself you would have been brave, that you would have spoken, that you would have resisted. But the silence had a way of softening even the strongest voices, of pressing down upon even the boldest hearts. It was not a silence you could ignore. It was a silence you learned to carry. That was life for civilians at the beginning. Not yet terror, not yet open cruelty, but the stillness of a world holding its breath, waiting for something it could not yet name. Nazi regime, the silence before fear, the streets under watch. The silence of the first days soon gave way to something more visible, something you could no longer pretend not to notice. The streets themselves changed. It was not sudden, not the kind of transformation that arrives overnight like snow on rooftops. No, it was gradual, like shadows lengthening as the sun sinks behind the horizon. At first, there were only a few posters pasted unevenly on walls, bright red, sharp black lines, words that promised renewal and unity. They seemed harmless, even invigorating to some. But soon, the posters multiplied, layered over one another, covering bricks and boards until they became the very skin of the city. And alongside the posters came the flags. Great red banners unfurled from windows, stretching across streets like veins of a new organism, pulsing with the illusion of strength. They flapped in the wind above bakeries, above schools, above apartments where children pressed their noses against the glass. You could not escape their gaze, for they were not merely decorations, they were reminders, proclamations, warnings, and with the flags came eyes. Eyes not only on fabric, painted into symbols, but human eyes. Watchful, suspicious, recording every detail as if each step you took was an entry in a ledger that could one day be used against you. The streets you once knew, where you bought apples from the old man on the corner, where you lingered to chat with a neighbor, where children played tag around the lamppost, became places of observation. To walk them was no longer a casual act. It was a performance. How did you carry yourself? Did you lift your chin proudly when you passed a flag? Did you move quickly enough not to attract attention, but not so quickly that you seemed afraid? Did you greet those in uniform with respect? And did your eyes flicker too long toward the poster of the leader, smiling grimly from the wall? These became calculations that civilians performed unconsciously, turning a stroll down the street into a careful dance with consequences. People adjusted, as humans always do. They learned how to look ordinary, how to blend into the background. They carried shopping baskets even when they had little to buy, just to seem purposeful. They walked with measured steps, avoiding the extremes of haste or hesitation. They smiled politely when spoken to, even when their stomachs knotted with unease. And all the while, the streets kept watching. Children noticed, though they did not always understand. They tugged at their mothers' hands, asking why the soldiers marched so often now, why men in long coats stopped people at corners, why strangers whispered in doorways before quickly dispersing. Mothers shushed them, pressing lips tight, telling them not to ask questions in public. The lesson was clear. Curiosity had become dangerous. The streets themselves punished those who forgot. The propaganda was everywhere. Loudspeakers were installed in town squares, crackling with speeches that echoed through the narrow alleys, bouncing against stone walls until the words seemed to seep into the bricks themselves. Unity, strength, purity, destiny. Words stripped of warmth, hammered into rhythm, repeated until they ceased to mean anything except command. Civilians did not have the choice to ignore them. Even inside their homes, the noise bled through. The thin walls, demanding to be heard. Shops displayed approved slogans in their windows. Some did so willingly, eager to align themselves with power. Others did so with reluctance, knowing that refusal would be noticed. Even the simplest act, choosing what to hang in your window, became a declaration of loyalty or disloyalty, and thus a matter of survival. The streets had a new language, one written not in whispers but in symbols, colors, and the absence of dissent. And then there were the patrols, men in uniforms, boots striking against stone, their rhythm like a second clock that dictated the pace of life. You could hear them before you saw them, the thud of leather soles echoing down the street, a sound that made conversation falter and laughter die mid-breath. People stepped aside, lowering their eyes, clutching bags tighter, pulling children closer. A salute was expected, sometimes demanded, and even the hesitation of a moment could be remembered, filed away, used later. The streets no longer belonged to the people. They belonged to those who marched them. Yet, daily life continued. Women still carried bread home wrapped in brown paper. Men still lingered outside tobacco shops. Children still played hopscotch, drawn in chalk. But each act carried weight now, each moment shadowed by the gaze of unseen judges. Even play was not free. Children were taught new games, new songs, ones that mirrored the chants of the rallies. Slowly, even their laughter became part of the performance. One of the strangest things about those streets was how ordinary they appeared on the surface. The cobblestones were the same, the lampposts still crooked from storms long past, the baker still leaning out of his doorway to call at passers-by. And yet, beneath that surface lay an invisible current, like electricity humming under the skin of the city. You could feel it in your bones, even if you could not name it. That was the paradox of life under the regime. Everything was the same, and nothing was the same. For civilians, the streets became a theater of compliance. You learned to play your part, to bow your head at the right moment, to laugh at the right kind of joke, to keep your silence where it was required. And in doing so, you preserved yourself. But in that preservation, something else was lost. Piece by piece, the streets stole not only freedom, but authenticity. They demanded masks, and in time, people forgot the shape of their true faces. There were those who resisted quietly, of course. A woman who refused to hang a banner. A man who spoke a little too freely at the tavern. A teacher who kept forbidden books hidden in a drawer. But the streets noticed. The streets always noticed. And soon enough, those faces would vanish from the crowd, their absence explained in hushed tones, their doors sealed or their shops closed for good. People learned to walk faster past such places, to erase their memory before memory itself became incriminating. The streets became corridors of silence, punctuated only by the thunder of boots and the drone of slogans. And yet, inside that silence, civilians carried an invisible weight, the constant awareness that they were being watched, judged, measured against a standard they had never chosen. It was not only the soldiers or officials who watched, it was also the neighbors, the shopkeepers, the children taught to repeat and report. The streets were not simply lined with walls and windows, they were lined with ears. And so, the simple act of walking home from the market became something more profound. Each step was a reminder, you are not alone, you are not unseen, you are not safe. And yet you must continue, you must perform, you must survive. That was life under watch. Ordinary streets transformed into stages where every act could become evidence. This was how fear grew roots, not in the prisons or the camps alone, but in the very cobblestones civilians walked every day. The streets became both pathways and cages, both familiar and alien. They were home, and they were threat. And civilians learned, step by step, to carry that contradiction in silence, the bread that was missing. Hunger does not arrive suddenly. It creeps in, subtle as a shadow at dusk, until one day you realize it has become a permanent companion. In the beginning, families whispered to each other that it was only temporary, that the shortages were the natural result of war and disruption, that the shelves would fill again once stability returned. But days passed, then weeks, then months, and the shelves remained sparse, the baskets carried home lighter with every trip. The bread was smaller now. That was the first thing people noticed. Where once loaves were thick and golden, filling the air with the smell of yeast and warmth, now they were thin, dense, and grey. A single loaf had to stretch across a household, divided carefully into slices so thin you could almost see light through them. Butter, when it appeared at all, came in small lumps the size of a thumb. Milk was watered down until it tasted more of emptiness than nourishment. And meat became a memory, something children described as if it belonged to fairy tales rather than kitchens. Lines grew longer outside bakeries. Women with shawls wrapped tightly against the cold, children clutching ration cards, men returning. From work with tired eyes, all stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting for hours to claim what little there was. The lines themselves became part of daily life, a second home where people exchanged weary glances but rarely words, for words could be overheard, and hunger was safer than suspicion. The rhythm of life shifted from hours of work to hours of waiting to see if there would be enough flour, enough potatoes, enough coal to make it through another week. The regime called it sacrifice. Posters declared that hunger was noble, that tightening one's belt was proof of loyalty, that each rumbling stomach was a contribution to the cause. Civilians were told to feel pride in their deprivation, to wear it like a badge of honor. Children were taught to sing songs about the beauty of sharing crumbs. Housewives were instructed in how to stretch a meal from nothing. Soup made from turnip peels, bread mixed with sawdust, coffee brewed from roasted acorns. These were not just recipes, they were lessons in endurance disguised as patriotism. But hunger does not listen to speeches, hunger gnaws at dignity. It hums in the belly at night, keeping sleep shallow and restless. It makes tempers flare at the dinner table, turning fathers into shouters, mothers into weepers, children into silent, hollow-eyed ghosts. It lingers in the classroom, where students cannot concentrate on lessons because their stomachs ache, where teachers themselves pause mid-sentence to swallow the dryness in their mouths. Hunger does not inspire loyalty, it inspires desperation. There were moments when desperation spilled onto the streets. A woman collapsing in a breadline, her body too weak to carry her forward, a fight breaking out over the last bag of flour, a child caught stealing a potato from a cart, dragged away by officials while his mother screamed. These moments were brief, quickly suppressed, but they left echoes. Civilians learned from them to remain quiet, to remain patient, to hide their desperation behind masks of obedience. Inside homes, families adapted. Mothers became inventors, turning scraps into meals with a creativity born of necessity. They boiled weeds for soup, ground chestnuts into flour, stretched bones across multiple broths until they disintegrated. Fathers went without so their children might eat, though the children often pretended not to notice, leaving their own plates unfinished so their parents might have a little more. Hunger taught not only sacrifice, but secrecy. No one admitted how little they had for fear it might attract envy, pity, or worse, the attention of those who could accuse them of disloyalty. And yet, in that hunger, there was a strange kind of intimacy. Families gathered closer around small tables, their bodies warmed by proximity as much as by food. They learned to savor each crumb, to find gratitude in the rare appearance of butter, to share stories while gnawing on crusts so that the words might fill the silence that food could not. Hunger stripped life down to essentials, and in that bareness, civilians clung fiercely to the scraps of humanity that remained. But there was also shame. To be seen as weak, to admit hunger, was dangerous. Propaganda praised strength and condemned fragility. Civilians were taught to hide their suffering, to present faces of stoic endurance even as their bodies thinned. Women applied rouge to cheeks, to disguise pallor. Men tightened belts and straightened spines, walking as if they carried strength rather than emptiness. Children learned quickly not to cry over empty plates, and so hunger became invisible, a silent epidemic that consumed, without leaving traces, at least not traces that could be safely spoken of. Neighbors noticed, of course. They noticed when a family seemed to have more than others, when the smell of meat drifted from a kitchen, when children wore fuller cheeks. Rumors spread quietly. Perhaps they had connections. Perhaps they had access to the black market. Perhaps they were betraying others to feed themselves. Hunger sharpened suspicion as much as it sharpened ribs. Trust, already fragile under the weight of surveillance, grew thinner still. The black market thrived in shadows. Men met in alleys to trade cigarettes for butter, jewelry for flour, secrets for meat. Women whispered about where to find eggs, about which farmer might be willing to risk selling a hidden chicken. But every transaction carried risk. Informants lurked everywhere, ready to report profiteers and buyers alike. One careless word could lead to confiscation, imprisonment, or worse. Yet still, people risked it, because hunger erodes caution as much as it erodes flesh. Children carried hunger into their dreams. They dreamed of tables heavy with bread, of steaming bowls of stew, of apples so large they needed 2 hands to hold. They woke with damp cheeks and empty hands, only to find thin slices waiting for them in the morning. Their drawings changed. Two, where once they sketched houses and animals, now they sketched food. Teachers noticed but said nothing. To comment on hunger was to invite attention, and attention was dangerous. The strangest part was how hunger became normal. At first, the ache was unbearable, a constant reminder of what had been lost. But over time, bodies adjusted. The ache dulled, becoming part of the background, like the sound of boots in the street or the flutter of flags above rooftops. Civilians stopped asking when the bread would return to its former size. They simply learned to live with less. That was the cruelest trick hunger played. It taught people to accept deprivation as ordinary until they could not remember what fullness had felt like. Yet hunger left its mark. It carved hollows into cheeks, deepened lines around eyes, bent shoulders under invisible weight. It stole energy from workers, laughter from children, tenderness from families. It was more than the absence of food. It was the absence of ease, of abundance, of the simple joy of breaking bread without calculation. Hunger turned each meal into a reminder of fragility, of dependence, of control. Because hunger was not only the result of war, it was a tool. Civilians began to understand that. Food was rationed not merely because supplies were scarce, but because scarcity controlled behavior. A full stomach breeds courage, but an empty one breeds compliance. When bread was the difference between survival and starvation, loyalty became easier to demand. To dissent was to risk losing even the crumbs you still had. Hunger disciplined better than fear alone, and so the bread that was missing was not only bread. It was freedom, it was dignity, it was the possibility of choice. Every slice measured out by ration cards was a slice of control, a reminder that civilians survived not by their own strength, but at the mercy of those who distributed crumbs. Hunger became the leash that bound them, tightening around their throats, even as they tried to swallow the dry crusts that barely kept them alive. That was life under the regime, not only watched, not only silenced, but starved into submission. Civilians endured because endurance was the only option. They endured quietly, with thin bodies and hollow eyes, carrying their hunger like an invisible uniform. And though they dreamed of bread, they learned instead to survive on the taste of silence. The fear of speaking. Words have weight, and under the Nazi regime, that weight was crushing. In ordinary times, words are breath, conversation, laughter over meals, whispers in corridors. But in those years, words became dangerous objects, blades that could cut both speaker and listener. People learned to measure every syllable, to test every phrase in their minds before daring to release it. And often, they chose silence instead. Silence, at least, could not betray you. The danger was not only in what one said, but in how it was heard, and by whom. Walls seemed to sprout. Ears, neighbors acquired sharper eyes, and even friends became potential risks. A careless remark, a sigh at the wrong moment, a muttered complaint about food shortages or long queues could be repeated, misinterpreted, or deliberately twisted until it became an accusation of disloyalty. And in those days, an accusation was enough. Guilt did not need proof. Suspicion alone could lead to questioning, to arrest, to disappearance. It was not only adults who carried this burden. Children, too, were taught that words mattered, but they were taught differently. In schools, teachers drilled them in loyalty, rewarding those who repeated slogans with enthusiasm, punishing hesitation. Youth organizations encouraged them to listen at home, to notice if parents or siblings spoke doubt, to report anything that sounded like disobedience. For children, patriotism became entwined with betrayal. For parents, it meant every word at the dinner table was a gamble. Families whispered less and less until their homes were filled with silence heavier than hunger. This silence stretched into daily life. Streets that once hummed with chatter grew subdued. People greeted each other with nods rather than conversations. eyes avoiding contact, lips pressed tightly shut. Even when friends met, they spoke in riddles, circling around meanings without ever touching them directly. "How are things?" could mean a dozen different truths, but the only safe answer was always, "Fine." Conversations lost their depth, their intimacy, replaced by an endless performance of loyalty, a chorus of rehearsed phrases, echoing slogans pasted on every wall. Yet within that silence, there was still communication. Civilians developed new languages, a raised eyebrow, a quick glance, a hesitation before answering. A hand placed gently on an arm could say more than a paragraph. A pause before raising a glass could signal discontent, though it had to be subtle, too subtle for anyone else to notice. Words had been stolen, but meaning still lingered, hidden in gestures, hidden in the spaces between silences. At night, however, behind closed doors, some dared to speak. Families gathered in whispers, conversations no louder than the ticking of clocks. Parents leaned close to children, reminding them in urgent tones that what was said must remain inside these walls, that repeating it outside could mean ruin. Lovers spoke beneath blankets, breath mingling as if secrecy could be sealed with warmth. Friends huddled in darkened rooms, testing the strength of their trust by daring to exchange forbidden thoughts. These conversations were both a relief and a terror, each word carrying the thrill of honesty and the threat of exposure. There was always the possibility of listening ears. Informants were everywhere, some motivated by ideology, others by fear, others still by the promise of reward. A colleague at work, a neighbor across the hall, even a distant cousin might report what they heard, whether out of conviction or desperation. Civilians could never be sure who might betray them, and so paranoia grew, weaving itself into every interaction. Trust became as scarce as bread, and sometimes even more dangerous. Propaganda filled the gaps that silence left behind. Radios blared, speeches and music saturating the air with messages of loyalty and strength. Newspapers printed stories of victory and unity, erasing defeats, erasing dissent. Posters plastered walls, repeating slogans until they felt less like words and more like the air itself, impossible to ignore. In such an environment, to remain silent was already an act of defiance, because the regime demanded not only obedience, but enthusiasm. Civilians were expected to echo the slogans, to repeat them with bright voices, to perform loyalty in both words and silence alike. But speaking too loudly was also dangerous. Those who praised too enthusiastically risked suspicion as well. Zeal could appear false, an attempt to hide disloyalty. Civilians walked a narrow line, balancing their words between too much and too little, between silence and speech, never certain where the line truly lay. It was a life lived in perpetual calculation, where every word became a risk assessment, every conversation a test of survival. The result was a generation who learned to swallow their thoughts before they formed, who learned that the safest sentence was no sentence at all. Children grew into adults who distrusted their own tongues, who weighed every word as if it were currency, who became strangers even to themselves. To survive meant to silence not only speech, but also the inner voice that once demanded honesty. Over time, silence became more than strategy. It became habit, then identity. And yet, silence had costs. It eroded intimacy. Couples shared beds but not confessions. Friends met but avoided the subjects closest to their hearts. Parents guarded their words even from their children, fearing that innocence might spill truth where it should not. This distance hollowed relationships, leaving bonds that looked intact on the outside but were fragile within. Love, too, became muted, smothered beneath the weight of unspoken fears. There were exceptions, of course. Some civilians refused silence, at least in private. They gathered secretly in resistance circles, where words flowed again, where ideas could be spoken aloud, without masks. These gatherings were rare, risky, often infiltrated, but for those who dared, they were lifelines. To speak freely, even for an hour, was to remember what it meant to be human. It was to resist not only the regime, but the erosion of self. For most civilians, however, the risk was too great, and so they chose the safety of silence, enduring. In quiet, rather than risking destruction, the silence of civilians under the Nazi regime was not empty. It was full of swallowed protests, of unspoken grief, of restrained anger. It was heavy, pressing down on lungs until breathing itself felt dangerous. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of suppression, of a world where even words were rationed, where truth was smuggled in glances and gestures. And in that silence, civilians carried their private thoughts like contraband. They hid them in diaries written in careful code, in letters tucked deep within drawers, in prayers murmured at night when no one else was listening. These fragments of honesty survived, fragile as they were, because people could not completely surrender their voices. Even when silenced, the human spirit seeks expression, and though most words remained trapped, they echoed within hearts, waiting for the day they might be spoken again. That was life under the regime, hunger in the belly, silence on the tongue, fear in every thought. Civilians endured by biting back their words, by choosing survival over honesty. And while silence protected them, it also imprisoned them. It was both shield and shackle, a survival tactic that hollowed the soul. The fear of speaking became the fear of being, and yet they endured, one wordless day after another, until silence itself became their second skin. The regime's school. Children were the regime's most carefully tended soil, while adults could be silenced, threatened, or broken into compliance. Children were to be shaped, molded, cultivated, until loyalty sprouted naturally within them. Schools, once places of curiosity and discovery, became factories of ideology, where history was rewritten, science bent, and language sharpened into slogans. Civilians saw their children carry new books to class, with covers stamped not with stories of wonder, but with symbols of power. And as parents, they faced a quiet despair. Their own sons and daughters were being taught to love what they feared, to repeat what they dared not say. The day began with ritual. Every morning, children lined up in rows, their voices rising in chants that praised the leader and the nation. For some, it was thrilling. The rhythm, the sense of belonging, the pride of wearing uniforms stitched to look like miniature soldiers. For others, it was confusing. But confusion did not matter. The repetition itself was the lesson. Words carved themselves into young minds through rhythm and insistence, until children spoke them, not because they understood, but because they could not forget. Teachers, too, were transformed. Many had once taught poetry, music, or philosophy with joy, but under the regime, they became guardians of doctrine. Some did so willingly, swept by conviction. Others did so reluctantly, fearing dismissal or worse if they resisted. Either way, their classrooms changed. Geography lessons focused on borders that must expand. History glorified victories while erasing defeats. Biology twisted itself into arguments of superiority and exclusion. Children learned not how to question, but how to believe, not how to discover, but how to obey. Even play was reshaped. Civilians remembered watching their children return home from school, no longer carrying drawings of flowers or animals, but sketches of soldiers and flags. Games in the yard echoed drills taught in youth organizations, marching, saluting, pretending to conquer imaginary enemies. Wooden swords replaced dolls. Chants replaced lullabies. Parents who once encouraged imagination now feared it, because imagination itself had been conscripted. The innocence of childhood was replaced by the shadow of war, even before children could spell the word. The most painful transformation came at the dinner table. Children repeated what they learned at school with pride, their voices bright, their eyes shining. The leader protects us. Our people are stronger. Enemies must be defeated. For parents, each phrase was a knife. To challenge it was dangerous. To remain silent was unbearable. Many smiled weakly, nodding, choosing survival over correction. Others attempted careful diversions, redirecting conversation toward harmless topics. But even silence could feel like betrayal when their children's voices carried such conviction. It was as if the regime had placed itself between parents and their children, whispering into young ears louder than any lullaby could. Children were also taught vigilance. They were told that loyalty meant honesty, that honesty meant reporting disloyalty, even at home. Teachers praised those who brought stories of overheard complaints, rewarding them as examples of bravery. Youth organizations encouraged children to watch their neighbors, their relatives, even their parents, for signs of disobedience, and so a quiet fracture opened within families. Parents no longer trusted their children completely. Children no longer trusted their parents unconditionally. Love remained, but suspicion coiled beneath it, twisting the bond until it hurt. Some civilians tried to resist in small ways. A mother might tell a bedtime story that carried hidden meanings of kindness and equality. A father might teach his child an old folk song that spoke of endurance rather than conquest. These were fragile acts of defiance, seeds planted in secret, hoping they might survive the weeds of propaganda. Yet even these small gestures carried risk, for children sometimes repeated them at school, and what was innocent at home could become dangerous outside. Resistance, even in whispers, was a gamble. With a child's safety, the school also became a place of division. Children were separated not only by grades, but by blood, by background, by origin. Some were celebrated, raised to leadership, while others were excluded, humiliated, or expelled altogether. Friends who once played together were told they could not. Desks that once stood side by side were left empty as classmates disappeared without explanation. Children learned early who belonged and who did not, and they carried those lessons into their hearts as truths, not realizing they were lies. Civilians saw this division ripple through their communities. Families whispered about children who had been taken away, sent to institutions, or denied further schooling. Neighbors spoke of classmates who vanished suddenly, leaving behind only silence where laughter once echoed. And yet to ask questions was dangerous. Parents learned to grieve quietly, to tell their children not to ask why their friend was gone. The school had become not only a place of learning, but a stage for cruelty, where absence itself was a lesson over time. Children forgot what it felt like to learn freely. They absorbed not only lessons, but rhythms, attitudes, and expectations. Their handwriting carried slogans, their drawings bore symbols, their songs echoed propaganda. Civilians watching felt helpless. To protest was impossible. To withdraw, children from school unthinkable. Education was no longer a choice. It was a demand, and so parents endured the slow transformation of their children, mourning silently as innocence dissolved into obedience. Still, within some children, questions survived. Not every young mind was fully reshaped. Some whispered doubts to siblings late at night, asking why their teachers' words did not match what they saw at home, why posters spoke of abundance when their stomachs ached with hunger, why loyalty felt so heavy. These questions were fragile, dangerous, but they existed. Civilians who heard them often responded with silence, torn between fear and hope. For hope still lingered in those questions. The truth could not be erased completely, that even in indoctrination, the spark of doubt remained. But for most, the regime succeeded. An entire generation grew beneath its shadow, their childhoods shaped by its narratives. Civilians who survived those years would later say that the regime stole not only lives but childhoods, replacing laughter with slogans, stories with propaganda, curiosity with obedience. To be a child under the regime was to be taught not who you were, but who you must become, and that lesson, once learned, was hard to unlearn. The school was not only a building, it was a mechanism, a system that reached into every home, every family, every child. Civilians lived under its weight as surely as they lived under rationing and surveillance. For in shaping the children, the regime shaped the future. And for civilians, watching that future slip away was perhaps the heaviest burden of all. Letters that never arrived. Communication, once the fragile bridge between families, became another weapon in the regime's hands. Civilians lived not only with hunger and silence, but with absence. An absence carried inside envelopes that never reached their doors. An absence hidden in words censored, crossed out, or never written at all. Letters, which should have been lifelines, often became reminders of how tightly the regime held every corner of their existence. In the early years, families still tried to maintain threads of connection. A husband, conscripted to the front, would write to his wife, describing in carefully chosen words the weather, the food, the comradeship, never the battles, never the fear. A son, sent to labor far away, would send short notes to his mother, promising he was well, though the ink sometimes trembled as if the pen itself had hesitated. A daughter in a different city might write to her parents, assuring them she was safe, leaving unsaid the glances she endured, the scarcity she shared. Each letter carried both presence and absence, what was said and what could not be said. Civilians quickly learned to read between lines. A phrase about cold nights meant more than weather. It meant shortages, suffering, loneliness. A mention of good health often rang false, a code for endurance rather than comfort. When paper was scarce, postcards filled the gap, their words cramped and small, sentences hurried, each one weighed with double meaning. The absence of detail was itself a detail. Families read every word like scripture, searching for what was hidden, not only for what was written, but even these coded connections were not safe. Letters were censored, sometimes by ink-blackened lines, other times by their total disappearance. Civilians would wait for weeks, months, scanning mail deliveries, only to find nothing. Silence fell heavier than words ever could. Was the letter lost? Was it intercepted, or had the writer simply fallen silent forever? The uncertainty gnawed at families, creating an ache that could not be soothed. The act of writing itself became dangerous. Civilians hesitated before putting words to paper, fearing that too much honesty could harm the recipient. A complaint about hunger could be read as disloyalty. A note of grief might mark them as weak. Even love had to be restrained, for the wrong phrase could be misinterpreted. Letters became rehearsed, trimmed, shaped into safe patterns, expressions of loyalty, fragments of daily routine, prayers disguised as platitudes. Civilians often destroyed their drafts, starting over until the words felt flat but safe. Sometimes a letter would arrive long after it mattered. A mother might receive a note from her son months after hearing news of his death. A wife might hold in her hands words of hope from a husband who would never return. These letters were both treasure and torment, holding life in ink even as the body that wrote them lay buried or missing. Civilians would read them again and again, memorizing every stroke as if by repetition they could call the absent back. Yet each reading also deepened the wound, because the letter was a ghost, speaking from a past that could never be restored. The regime understood the power of silence. By controlling communication, it deepened isolation. Families became islands, unable to share truth even with those they loved most. Rumors filled the gaps, whispers from neighbors, hints overheard in markets. But rumors were dangerous too. Passing them on could bring punishment. And so, civilians learned to live with not knowing, to carry uncertainty as if it were another ration, measured out daily, never enough to satisfy but always too heavy to ignore. In towns and villages, post offices became sites of both hope and despair. Civilians gathered at delivery times, their faces anxious, their eyes searching for an envelope with their name. Some received nothing for weeks, others clutched thin envelopes to their chest as if they carried gold. The silence of empty hands was as loud as the rustle of paper in others. A neighbor's joy could pierce like envy, but no one dared speak it aloud. Instead, they nodded politely, masking their hunger for words, returning home with emptiness, where hope should have been. Even when letters arrived, they were not always what they seemed. The regime used them as instruments of propaganda. Soldiers were instructed to write cheerful notes, to reassure civilians that all was well, that victories were certain. Civilians, reading, sometimes believed, sometimes doubted, but always carried the tension of not knowing which lines were truth and which were duty. A cheerful letter could be more painful than silence, for it forced the reader to question, is my loved one alive and well, or only pretending so that I may sleep at night? For those already under suspicion, letters became evidence. A careless phrase could be reported, a sentence misread could mark a family as disloyal. Civilians learned to guard their language, to use phrases that praised the leader, the nation, the future. Some did this sincerely, others as camouflage, but the result was the same. Words that once carried intimacy became hollow. Words meant for one became shaped for many eyes. Private language ceased to exist. Every letter was public, every sentence a performance. The absence of letters created a silence that shaped memory itself. Families sometimes convinced themselves they had received a letter when they had not, recalling phantom words that soothed them in the night. Others stopped expecting entirely, numbing themselves to disappointment. A few hoarded every scrap of correspondence, binding them with string, hiding them in drawers as if they were relics. Those small piles of paper became archives of endurance, testaments that someone somewhere had once remembered them. And yet, for all the pain, civilians continued to wait, to hope. The smallest note could sustain them for weeks, a single phrase becoming a talisman. I am well. I think of you. The day will come. Such words, stripped of detail, carried entire worlds within them. Civilians clung to them, repeating them silently, letting them echo in their hearts until the next envelope arrived, or never did. Letters that never arrived left holes in memory, spaces where voices should have been. Civilians carried those. Holes like wounds, filling them with imagination, with dreams, with silent prayers. For in the end, the absence of words became as powerful as the words themselves. Life under the regime was marked not only by what was spoken, but by what was never heard, by letters written and never sent, by voices silenced before they could reach the ones who needed them most. Life in the lines. Everyday survival under the Nazi regime was measured not in hours or in days, but in lines. Civilians came to understand that life itself was a sequence of cues, waiting for bread, waiting for coal, waiting for soap, waiting for news. The rhythm of existence was set not by freedom or choice, but by how long one was willing or able to stand in the cold, feet aching, stomach empty, hope fraying. Lines became the architecture of daily life, endless corridors of silence, broken only by coughs, whispers, and the shuffle of worn shoes against stone. Each line began in the morning mist, when shadows stretched long across cobblestones and the first few figures gathered outside shops not yet open. A mother holding her child would mark her place with weary determination, while an old man leaned on his cane, his breath clouding the air. Neighbors avoided too much eye contact. Who knew who might listen, who might report a careless word? So the silence grew heavier with every body that joined, until the line itself seemed to carry the weight of suspicion. By midday, the lines stretched around corners, curling through alleys, past broken walls plastered with propaganda posters. Smiling faces on the posters promised plenty, while just below them people shuffled in hunger and doubt. The contrast was sharp, cruel. Civilians learned not to look at the posters for too long. The smiling figures mocked them, their brightness. A lie that the line itself exposed. Ration cards were clutched tightly, as precious as coins once were. Each card was stamped, marked, folded and refolded, the edges soft with use. Civilians held them like relics, fearing loss, knowing that without them the line was useless, the weight meaningless. A piece of paper became the difference between food and hunger, warmth and cold. The card itself felt heavier than its size suggested because it carried not only sustenance but also control. Civilians did not own their lives. They rented them week by week, stamp by stamp. And yet the line was not just about scarcity, it was also about endurance. Civilians stood in the snow, in the rain, under the grey weight of clouds, their bodies swaying from fatigue, their thoughts drifting. Some whispered prayers, others replayed memories of meals from before, still tasting bread that was soft rather than stale, soup that was full rather than thin. Children, restless and shivering, asked questions their parents could not answer. When will it be our turn? Will there be enough left for us? Parents learned to answer with silence, a silence heavier than words. The line became a strange kind of community, bound not by choice, but by necessity. A woman might whisper a rumor to the person behind her, passing along scraps of information like crumbs of bread. A man might shift his weight so that the stranger beside him could rest a little. These small gestures carried a tenderness the regime could not stamp out. But they were fleeting, fragile, often interrupted by the sudden bark of an official or the suspicious glance of a neighbor who might report even kindness as weakness. Sometimes, after hours of waiting, civilians reached the front of the line only to find shelves bare. The emptiness of the shops struck like a blow. Faces crumpled, hands clenched ration cards tighter, but nothing could be done. The line dissolved slowly, its people scattering back into the gray streets, carrying not food, but disappointment. That disappointment traveled home with them, sitting heavy at the dinner table where meals were divided into portions too small to satisfy, stretched thinner each day. Coal was rationed too, and so lines formed in front of depots where black dust stained the ground. Civilians carried sacks, their shoulders bent, their backs aching, waiting to collect enough to keep a single room warm for a few nights. In those lines, silence was even deeper, for warmth was survival, and survival was not to be joked about. Men and women returned home with their sacks lighter than their hope, spreading coal dust across their floors like a dark reminder of how little they had left. The line was also a stage where propaganda performed its cruel play. Officials walked along, inspecting ration cards, repeating slogans, reminding civilians that sacrifice was patriotic. Some civilians repeated the phrases back, their voices hollow, performing loyalty for the sake of survival. Others stayed silent, their faces blank, their loyalty buried beneath hunger and exhaustion. Either way, the line was a space where individuality disappeared. All were reduced to waiting bodies, controlled by the same scarcity, bound by the same fear. Children grew up in the lines. They learned to stand still before they learned to play freely. They grew accustomed to watching their parents negotiate with shopkeepers, barter with neighbors, stretch a handful of flour into a week of meals. Childhood became an apprenticeship in endurance, taught not in classrooms, but in the endless hours of waiting. Their games were counting steps, tracing cracks in the pavement, pretending the ration cards were tickets to some secret adventure. But even in play, they absorbed the truth. Life itself was a cue, and joy was something always delayed, always out of reach. The psychological weight of the lines was immense. Civilians carried not just hunger, but the constant reminder of dependence. They knew they could not feed themselves without permission, could not warm their homes without approval, could not live outside the system the regime had built. Freedom was not taken in a single dramatic moment. It was eroded hour by hour, while standing in the cold, while waiting for bread, while hoping for coal. The line was the measure of how small their lives had become, and yet within the monotony, civilians found fragments of resilience. A mother sharing her last crust with a stranger, a child offering half an apple to another, a man humming an old song under his breath, quiet enough not to be noticed, loud enough to remind himself he was still alive. These moments glowed faintly like embers in the dark. They did not erase the suffering, but they kept despair from consuming everything. The line was both the symbol of control and the space where tiny sparks of humanity survived. At night, when the lines were over and families gathered in dim rooms, the memory of waiting lingered. Hunger tightened their stomachs, cold stiffened their hands, silence pressed heavy against their thoughts, and yet they endured because there was no other choice. They whispered to themselves that tomorrow's line might be shorter, that tomorrow's shelves might be fuller, that tomorrow might bring something other than absence. Hope itself became another ration, measured carefully, consumed sparingly, but never fully extinguished. Life in the lines was life under the regime, controlled, diminished, stripped of choice, yet never entirely destroyed. Civilians stood for hours, days, years, learning that survival was not about abundance, but about persistence. And though the lines broke their bodies, they did not break entirely the quiet defiance of hearts that still beat, still waited, still endured. The neighbor who disappeared. It always began with silence. A door left open too long, a curtain drawn, shut when it had once been left open, a sudden absence in the rhythm of daily life that everyone noticed but no one spoke about. In the world under the Nazi regime, disappearance was not rare. It was the shadow that hovered over every street, every stairwell, every shared glance. Neighbors vanished like pages torn from a book, leaving behind fragments of themselves that haunted those who remained. The first sign might be an empty chair at the dinner table across the courtyard, where laughter once floated up to the windows. Or perhaps it was the absence of footsteps in the stairwell, footsteps you had grown used to hearing late at night. Sometimes it was the sight of uniformed men at dawn, their boots thundering against the cobblestones as they stopped outside a particular door. The sound of a knock that was not a knock but a demand. Civilians learned to hold their breath when those knocks echoed, to lower their eyes, to pretend they heard nothing. When the neighbor disappeared, their belongings often remained, at least for a while. A pair of shoes by the door, a teacup half washed in the sink, a coat hung neatly on a peg, as if its owner might return within minutes. But no one returned. The shoes gathered dust, the cup dried and cracked, the coat sagged as if it had grown weary of waiting. Life itself seemed to pause around these objects, caught between presence and absence. They became silent witnesses to the fact that someone had been erased. Fear spread through the building like smoke. People whispered questions only to themselves. Who will be next? Did they say something careless? Was it because of their faith, their heritage, a grudge someone held? No answers came, only rumors. Thin threads civilians dared not pull too hard for fear of unraveling themselves. The truth was unknowable because under the regime, guilt was not measured by action, but by suspicion. To be chosen was enough. The neighbor's name was no longer spoken aloud. Families instructed their children to forget. If a child accidentally asked, "Where is Frau Müller?" the room grew heavy with silence, and the child learned quickly that forgetting was survival. Neighbors avoided looking at the vacant apartment, avoided speaking of the absent family, avoided even remembering too vividly. Memory itself became dangerous, and so they practiced erasure as though it were a duty, and yet forgetting was impossible. The absence shouted louder than presence ever had. Civilians felt it in the empty stairwell, in the silence of a courtyard where laughter had once echoed, in the hush of a marketplace missing a familiar voice. The regime demanded that people erase their neighbors, but the human heart refused. Even in silence, even in secrecy, they remembered. Some tried to preserve traces quietly. A woman tucked a photograph of her vanished neighbor into her Bible, hidden between thin pages. A man stored a borrowed book on his shelf and never returned it, keeping it as a kind of tombstone. These small acts of memory were dangerous, yet they gave civilians the comfort of resistance. Silent resistance, invisible resistance, but resistance nonetheless. The fear of disappearance warped relationships. Neighbors no longer trusted one another. Was the man downstairs listening? Was the woman across the hall friendly or dangerous? A careless word could become a weapon. A suspicion could lead to a knock on your door. Civilians withdrew into themselves, their friendships thinning into polite nods, their conversations reduced to small talk about weather and bread. Trust, once the foundation of community, became another casualty of the regime. But disappearance did more than silence. It taught complicity. When the boots came at dawn, when the knock sounded, civilians told themselves they could do nothing. Some even closed their shutters, turned up their radios, pretended to sleep. Others told themselves the disappeared must have done something to deserve it. It was easier to believe that guilt existed than to face the truth. Anyone could vanish. In this way, the regime shifted the weight of fear into the hearts of the people themselves, turning neighbors into judges, silence into a shield. And yet, guilt lingered. The day after a disappearance, civilians avoided the empty apartment, but they carried the knowledge with them. They carried it while buying bread, while waiting in lines, while tucking their children into bed. The absence was not just physical, it was moral, spiritual. Each disappearance left behind a question. Could I have done something? Should I have spoken? Should I have resisted? These questions had no answers, only a silence that deepened with every neighbor who vanished. Children, more than anyone, felt the confusion. They noticed absences, they asked questions, they sensed the fear. Some children absorbed the silence, learning to mimic their parents' blank faces, their careful words. Others whispered to each other in the corners of courtyards, inventing stories to explain the disappearances. Perhaps the neighbor had gone on a journey. Perhaps they had moved to a better place. Children, with their imaginations, softened the brutality into fairy tales, but even they knew that something darker lurked beneath. At night, the memory of the disappeared stirred in dreams. Civilians dreamt of voices calling from empty rooms, of footsteps echoing in stairwells, of faces pressed against windows that no longer opened. Dreams became haunted by the people they could no longer acknowledge in daylight. In sleep, their minds dared to remember what waking fear forbade, and still life went on. The lines for bread continued. The propaganda blared from radios. The flags waved in the streets. Civilians learned to live alongside absence as though it were another neighbor, invisible but always present. They passed the empty apartments daily, and with each passing their silence grew deeper, heavier. The regime had succeeded not only in removing bodies, but also in shaping the living into shadows of themselves. The neighbor who disappeared was more than an individual. They became a mirror of what could happen to anyone. Their absence was both a warning and a weight. Civilians carried it in their hearts, in their silences, in their careful steps. And though the regime demanded erasure, the memory endured quietly. secretly, in the corners of rooms, in the cracks of conscience, in the trembling of hands that still remembered the warmth of a vanished handshake. This was life for civilians. Under the Nazi regime, a life where presence could be erased in a heartbeat, where absence shouted louder than words, where neighbors disappeared and the living became prisoners of their silence. The radio in the living room. It was small, almost, humble by appearance, yet it dominated every home. The radio stood in the living room like a silent authority, a box of wood and wires that dictated reality. Families gathered around it not out of choice, but necessity, because in a world where newspapers were censored, where neighbors disappeared, where silence was survival, the radio became both the only voice and the loudest cage. When it crackled to life, everything else in the room stilled. Conversations stopped, forks hovered above plates, even the breathing of children seemed to pause. Civilians leaned forward, straining to catch each word, though the words were not meant to inform, but to command. The voice that filled the room was deep, rehearsed, and relentless, a voice that carried certainty as its weapon. It did not invite discussion, it demanded belief. Propaganda was not presented as opinion, but as truth carved in stone. The radio declared who was friend and who was enemy, who was to be trusted and who was to be despised. It announced victories, often exaggerated, sometimes invented. It painted the world in black and white. Purity versus corruption, loyalty versus betrayal, the future versus the past. The civilians sitting quietly in their living rooms absorbed it because there was no other choice. To question was dangerous, to doubt was isolating, and to resist was unthinkable. Children especially were captivated. They listened wide-eyed as the voice on the radio spoke with fire and authority, a voice that seemed to hold the weight of the world. Parents watched their children's faces with unease, realizing that the stories being told were shaping their minds faster than they themselves could. It was in the radio that children first learned the slogans, the chants, the divisions. It was in the radio that innocence began to dissolve. The propaganda was relentless. It was not enough to speak of victories at the front. It also invaded the intimate corners of civilian life. It told mothers how to raise their children, how to be loyal wives, how to serve the state before the self. It instructed fathers on sacrifice, discipline, and unwavering obedience. It glorified death for the nation as the highest form of honor, turning grief into duty. But alongside the loud declarations, there were absences too. The radio never spoke of defeats, of hunger, of neighbors who had vanished. It did not describe the lines at bakeries, the shortages of coal, the fear in stairwells. It was a carefully crafted world where suffering was erased and replaced by slogans, where pain was silenced beneath anthems. Civilians learned to live with the dissonance. The world the radio described and the world they lived in daily never aligned. Yet they carried both within them, a split reality they dared not voice. Some resisted silently, at least in the privacy of their thoughts. A father would nod at the announcements, but inside feel the weight of his empty stomach. A mother would murmur agreement while folding clothes that had been patched for the 5th time. A grandfather would listen to the fiery speeches and remember a different world, one not yet twisted by slogans. Resistance took the form of silent disbelief, but even silence was dangerous if it slipped. If a child repeated a comment at school, if a neighbor overheard a sigh, the most dangerous act of all was to tune the radio beyond the permitted frequencies. In some homes, late at night, when the children were asleep and the curtains were tightly drawn, fathers turned the dial slowly, cautiously, searching for forbidden voices. The static buzzed like a warning, but sometimes, faint, fragile, another world leaked through. Foreign broadcasts that spoke of real defeats, of truths that had been buried. Listening was a crime, but civilians risked it because truth, even whispered in static, was worth more than safety. In those moments, fear and hope mingled. Fear because discovery meant punishment severe enough to silence an entire household. Hope because the alternative voices reminded civilians that the world was larger than the box in their living rooms, that perhaps the regime was not eternal, that perhaps silence could one day end. The act of listening became an act of defiance, though one measured in heartbeats and shadows. But for most, the radio was not a source of resistance, but a tool of survival. Civilians learned the phrases it repeated them back when questioned, nodded when slogans were spoken in the marketplace. They aligned their visible selves with the voice of the radio, even if their invisible selves remained skeptical. The voice became part of them, not because they believed, but because they had to perform belief. Over time, the propaganda seeped into language itself. Civilians began to echo its words unconsciously, describing shortages as sacrifices, calling neighbors enemies, labeling silence loyalty. The radio did not just speak, it reshaped the way people thought, the words they chose, the stories they told themselves. Its greatest power was not in what it said, but in how it taught civilians to forget what words used to mean. In the evenings, when broadcasts ended, families sat in silence for a while. The crackling faded, the voice disappeared, leaving behind an emptiness that hummed. In that silence, thoughts emerged, private, dangerous thoughts that had to be quickly buried. A child asked an innocent question, "Why do we never lose?" A parent hushed them, fear heavy in the gesture. Another asked, "When will it end?" But the question dissolved into silence before it could finish. The radio became a ritual, a nightly communion. It dictated the rhythm of life, the boundaries of thought, the illusions of safety. Civilians gathered around it as though it were a hearth, but instead of warmth, it offered fire that burned trust, fire that consumed doubt, fire that reshaped identity, and yet, even in its dominance, cracks appeared. The louder the propaganda, the more civilians noticed the gap between words and reality. The radio declared abundance while the shelves grew bare. It announced victory while funerals multiplied. It praised unity while neighbors vanished. These contradictions did not go unnoticed, even if they could not be spoken. They lodged in the hearts of civilians as quiet seeds, seeds that one day, long after the war, would bloom into painful questions. How much did we believe? How much did we pretend? How much did we let the voice in the living room become our own? The radio was not just a device. It was a mirror of life under the regime, a single voice drowning out the many, a reality imposed over truth, a command disguised as comfort. Civilians lived with it, through it and against it, caught between silence and sound, between fear and endurance. This was life for civilians under the Nazi regime, a life where the radio in the living room did not simply broadcast, but invaded, colonized, and reshaped the very fabric of thought. Women in the shadows, they were everywhere. Though history often forgot to mention them, women carried the weight of a war they had not chosen, a war that drafted not only men, but the very rhythm of domestic life. Their hands became the hands that fed, mended, buried, and endured. If the men were the faces in uniforms, women were the shadows that stretched long behind them, silent yet indispensable. When the men marched away, husbands, brothers, fathers, women stayed behind to keep the fragile machinery of life running. It was they who stood in endless queues for bread, who learned to make a handful of potatoes last a week, who rationed sugar as though it were treasure, who patched the same clothes until fabric gave way to holes too large to conceal. Survival was not heroic, but it was relentless, and women bore its demands with a quiet endurance that was rarely recognized. The propaganda had plans for them too. The radio, the posters, the newspapers, all spoke of the ideal woman, loyal to her husband, devoted to her children, servant to the state. She was to be strong, but never independent, obedient, but never weak, fertile, but never weary. Her role was defined not by who she was, but by what she could produce: sons for the battlefield, daughters to repeat the cycle, meals from nothing, faith from despair. And yet, the reality in homes across the Reich was far less tidy than the slogans. Women were not just raising children and waiting by windows. They were also digging gardens where flowers once bloomed, pulling carts when horses had been taken, hauling coal in baskets, scavenging scraps of fabric to turn into warmth. They became seamstresses, farmers, repairers, guardians, and negotiators. Their strength was forged not in parades but in kitchens filled with smoke, in streets lined with rubble, in nights where they tucked frightened children into beds while hiding their own fear. Children looked to their mothers not only for food, but for a sense of safety, for explanations that fathers were no longer there to give. Women told stories to soften hunger, invented games to distract from air raid sirens, sang lullabies while praying the ceiling would not collapse above them. They carried on their shoulders both the visible weight of survival and the invisible weight of holding a family together in a world unraveling. There was also the burden of grief, quiet and unending. Telegrams arrived with words too sharp to absorb: missing in action, killed in service, honor in sacrifice. Women read them with trembling hands, then folded them away in drawers because life could not pause for mourning. Children still needed, feeding fire still needed tending. Grief became another chore, tucked between the washing and the waiting. They wept in silence, often at night when no one could see, because to collapse was a luxury they could not afford. The regime praised them publicly, but distrusted them privately. Female strength was useful only when it remained in service of the state. Independent thought was discouraged, initiative was punished if it strayed too far from obedience. Women who spoke too loudly, who asked too many questions, who showed too much sympathy for neighbors who had disappeared, these women were watched. A word to the wrong ear could mean interrogation, punishment, disappearance. And so women learned to guard not only their homes, but their tongues. Yet in this silence, some became pillars of quiet defiance. They hid ration cards for friends, whispered warnings to neighbors, passed secret messages in loaves of bread, small acts, almost invisible, but acts of resistance nonetheless. They were not generals or politicians, but their courage lived in the cracks of ordinary life, in refusing to let a hungry child starve, in offering a neighbor shelter, in holding on to fragments of humanity when the world demanded submission. Women carried another heavy weight too: guilt. For every son sent to war, for every daughter who parroted propaganda in school, for every silence they had to maintain, they asked themselves in private, am I complicit? Am I strong enough? Could I have done more? The shadows they lived in were not only cast by the war, but by their own questions. As the war dragged on, their roles grew harder, their burdens heavier. Bombings turned cities into skeletons, and women walked those ruins searching for food, for family, for meaning. They picked through rubble with bare hands, searching for memories. A photograph unburnt, a spoon still intact, a book that had survived. Flames. They became archivists of loss, curators of what little could be saved from destruction, and yet, despite everything, they endured. They endured hunger, silence, grief, fear, and exhaustion. They endured because they had no choice, because children needed them, because life insisted on continuing. They endured without medals, without recognition, often without thanks. When the war ended, it was women who carried families out of the wreckage. Men returned broken, fewer in number, some never at all. It was women who rebuilt homes, who cleared rubble, who planted seeds again in soil soaked with ash. Their shadows stretched far beyond the war, shaping the post-war world in ways that went unrecorded, unacknowledged. History often speaks of soldiers and leaders, of battles and borders. But in the quiet, hidden spaces, it was women who bore the war in silence. They were the shadows. But without them, there would have been no one left to live in the light when the war finally ended. This was life for civilians under the Nazi regime, a life where women carried the weight of survival in silence. Their strength hidden in the shadows, their endurance the foundation of a world that refused to collapse entirely. The weight of guilt. When the guns quieted and the bombs stopped falling, silence returned to the streets. But it was not a peaceful silence. It was a silence thick with questions, heavy with the unspoken weight of what had been seen, what had been ignored, what had been allowed to happen. For the civilians who had lived under the Nazi regime, survival came at a cost far greater than hunger or fear. The cost was carried deep within, in the form of guilt, visible in their eyes, etched into their voices, lingering in every unfinished sentence. In the early years, when the regime rose with its flags and parades, many had stood along the streets, clapping, cheering, or at least watching in silence. Some had truly believed, others had simply gone along, afraid to stand out, unwilling to risk what dissent would bring. And in that compliance, even when born of fear, the seeds of guilt were planted. Years later, when the rubble settled and the horrors of camps and mass graves became known, those same people would look at themselves in mirrors and whisper, "What did I do? What did I fail to do?" The weight of guilt was not evenly distributed. Some had spoken out too late. Some had turned their faces away when neighbors disappeared in the night. Some had accepted the propaganda not because they were convinced, but because it was easier than questioning. And some had simply tried to survive, telling themselves they were powerless. But afterward, powerlessness no longer felt like a defense. Silence itself had become a crime. There was the guilt of participation, of course, the men and women who joined the party, who wore uniforms, who benefited from others' suffering. But there was also the quieter guilt, the guilt of the ordinary. The mother who told her child not to ask about the Jewish family next door, the shopkeeper who shrugged when certain customers no longer came, the teacher who repeated slogans in the classroom while knowing deep down they were lies. They had not pulled triggers, but they had obeyed, and obedience had paved the way. After the war, when whispers of atrocities grew into undeniable truths, civilians faced not only their memories, but the judgment of the world. Newsreels showed starving survivors, piles of bodies, horrors too great to comprehend, and people asked, both outsiders and their own children, "Did you know?" It was a question impossible to answer without shame, for how could one admit to knowing and doing nothing? And how could one admit to not knowing when it had happened so close, in plain sight? The weight of guilt lived in the smallest details of daily life. A mother might cradle her child at night and think of the mothers whose children had been taken. A farmer might walk his land and remember that his fields had once belonged to someone else, someone now gone. A worker might sit at his bench and wonder if the machines he built had been used in factories of death. Everywhere traces of complicity lingered, poisoning even the simplest joys. This guilt was rarely spoken aloud. To confess was to risk not only shame, but rejection. So families buried it in silence, generation after generation. Children grew up sensing the heaviness in their parents' eyes, the way questions were avoided, the way stories stopped mid-sentence. They inherited guilt without ever fully understanding it. Some tried to justify themselves, to ease the burden. "We had no choice. We didn't know everything. We were afraid." And these words were true but incomplete. Fear explained silence, but it did not erase its consequences. Not knowing was sometimes genuine, but sometimes it was a choice, a refusal, to see what was too uncomfortable to confront. And having no choice was true in moments, but not in all. In some instances, small acts of defiance could have made a difference. To acknowledge that was to acknowledge that more could have been done, and that acknowledgement was unbearable. So the guilt lived in shadows, unspoken but never absent. It surfaced in nightmares, in the way people avoided certain streets, in the way they could not look neighbors in the eye. It echoed in churches, in whispered prayers that begged forgiveness for sins unnamed but deeply felt. It colored conversations long after the war ended, creating a culture of silence where truth was too painful to speak. For many, guilt became intertwined with survival. To admit complicity was to risk losing the only thing they had left, the fragile thread of dignity. And so they clung to stories of victimhood, stories of bombings, of hunger, of suffering under the regime, as shields against the deeper truth that they had also been bystanders, sometimes even beneficiaries. It was easier to remember their own pain than to confront the pain they had ignored in others. But guilt has a way of seeping through, of haunting the edges of life. It surfaced in sudden moments, when a lullaby reminded a mother of a neighbor's child she no longer saw, when a piece of music recalled a man who had once played but was no longer there, when a book carried the name of an author who had vanished. Ordinary objects became reminders, and reminders became wounds. Even decades later, guilt lingered. Elderly civilians told their grandchildren carefully edited versions of the past, omitting the silences, the complicities, the moments they turned away. Yet in their pauses, in their hesitation, in their eyes, the truth was still visible. The grandchildren often carried questions they dared not ask, questions that echoed the old unanswerable ones. What did you know? What did you do? This was life. For civilians under the Nazi regime, not only in the years of war, but in the years after. Life continued, yes, but beneath it lay a burden of guilt that no rebuilding, no silence, no passing of time could entirely erase. After the silence, when the echoes of war had faded and the boots no longer marched through the streets, what remained was not peace, but a strange, uneasy stillness. Civilians emerged from basements, from shelters, from silence itself, into a world that felt both familiar and unrecognizable. The same streets stretched ahead, yet lined now with ruins. The same houses stood, but their windows were broken, their walls scarred. The war had ended, but the life that awaited was not the life they had known before. After the silence, people said, as though silence itself were a season that had passed. But silence did not truly end. It simply changed shape. Before, silence had meant survival, knowing when not to speak, what not to ask, which questions to swallow. Now silence became memory, what not to tell children, which truths to hide, which wounds to bury too deep for words. The war was over, but life under the Nazi regime had carved scars into every corner of existence. Civilians found themselves walking among ghosts, neighbors who had not returned, families torn apart, entire communities erased. Each empty space carried a memory, and each memory carried a question. How do you live after this? How do you build again when the foundations themselves are haunted? For many, rebuilding meant clinging desperately to normalcy. Markets reopened, children returned to schools, factories began to hum once more. Bread returned to the shelves, though never in the abundance once dreamed of. People smiled again, or at least tried. But beneath those smiles, there was an unspoken recognition. Life would never be innocent again. The younger ones, those who had grown up entirely under the regime, looked at the new world with confusion. They had been taught to salute, to chant, to believe. Now those salutes were forbidden, the chants condemned, the beliefs exposed as lies. They were told that everything they had learned was wrong. But how does a child unlearn? How does a teenager who has known only one story suddenly begin to trust another? After the silence came disorientation as generations tried to untangle what was real from what had been forced upon them. The older ones carried heavier burdens. They had lived long enough to remember before, and now they stood in the after, carrying the knowledge of what had happened in between. For them, survival was not only about food or shelter, it was about navigating memory. They built houses while avoiding conversations. They planted gardens while avoiding certain names. They sat at tables where chairs would always remain empty. In some villages, whispers became louder. Questions began to surface. Where did the neighbors go? Why did the teacher disappear? Why did no one speak? The answers were difficult, and so often they were avoided. Adults shook their heads, changed the subject, or said, "It is better not to remember." But memory has a way of pressing itself forward, no matter how deeply buried. The silence after. The war was different, heavier in some ways. It was no longer enforced by fear of the secret police, but by shame, by grief, by the impossibility of expressing the inexpressible. Words could not capture the enormity of what had happened. And when words fail, silence remains. Some tried to write. Diaries, letters, memoirs began to appear, fragments of truth captured on paper. These writings did not erase the silence, but they pierced it. They offered glimpses of what life had been, what choices had been made, what prices had been paid. Yet even these were selective. No one could tell the whole truth. The whole truth was too vast, too heavy, too unbearable. After the silence also came judgment. Trials were held, not only for leaders but for ordinary people who had collaborated. Civilians watched these proceedings with a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that justice was being served. Fear because they wondered quietly whether they too might be guilty in ways the law would never prosecute. The world looked upon them and asked, "How could you allow this?" And they looked upon themselves and asked the same. Yet life had to go on. Children needed raising, cities needed rebuilding, fields needed plowing. So people carried their guilt, their memories, their unanswered questions into the ordinary tasks of survival. They repaired roofs while avoiding the ruins of certain buildings. They planted seeds while ignoring the silence where laughter had once been. They married, they had children, they grew old, but underneath it all the silence remained. It lingered not only in the generation that had lived through the regime, but in the ones that followed. Children sensed it in the hesitations of their parents, in the half-answers to questions, in the way certain topics were avoided at dinner. Grandchildren felt it in the sadness of their grandparents' eyes, in the way photographs were hidden in drawers, in the way stories ended abruptly with the phrase, "You would not understand." But silence is not empty. Silence carries echoes, and those echoes shape the future as much as words. The silence of civilians under the Nazi regime did not disappear after the war. It seeped into the fabric of families, of societies, of nations. It became part of identity, part of history, part of the invisible inheritance passed down through time. After the silence was not truly after. It was simply another form of living with it. Civilians carried on, yes, but they carried on with ghosts beside them, shadows in their hearts, unanswered questions in their minds. And perhaps the greatest weight of all was knowing that what they had endured, what they had allowed, what they had survived, could happen again. That knowledge made the silence even heavier, because it demanded a vigilance, a responsibility that many felt unprepared to bear. This was life for civilians under the Nazi regime, not only during those dark years, but in all the years that followed. It was a life lived in shadow, in survival, in silence. And long after the last bomb had fallen, after the last camp was liberated, after the last soldier had laid down his gun, the silence endured, shaping memories, shaping identities, shaping the very essence of what it meant to live after such a time. The war ended, the regime fell, but the silence remained.